It's been a long, scary development cycle, but here we are. Halo Infinite's campaign is finally in our hands. It's been a pretty long gap since the last time we saw Master Chief, and still not long enough since we last saw Spartan Locke, and 343 have taken an entirely new approach to how they develop Halo. Rather than try and create a new numbered campaign with their own take on Halo's aesthetic, Infinite goes back to a look that's much more familiar to anyone who grew up with Bungie's entries in the series, while taking the gameplay to a place it's never been before, an open-world sandbox that's primed to enable some of Halo's iconic emergent gameplay moments to a degree that's never been possible before. 343 has had a rocky relationship with fans and with Halo as a franchise, but with an extra year to get this version right, how did they fail this time? Let's get one thing clear right out of the gate. At its most essential, being a game about pointing a gun at stuff and expediently making it not alive, Halo Infinite absolutely excels. This is owed almost entirely to the game's fantastic feeling gunplay. 343 really nailed the game feel in Infinite. I know they're kind of a meme now thanks to Call of Duty, but as someone who absolutely lives for catharsis in combat, the hit marker sounds Infinite uses send a spike of dopamine to the brain every time a bullet connects. Animations complement that feeling, being a lot more natural and organic in Infinite than the more mechanical start-and-stop animations that were in 343's previous Halo games. Even something as simple as the gun bobbing as you run around the map comes off a lot more organic than Chief or Locke felt in Halo 4 and Guardians. Gunfire similarly sounds fantastic, even if you're a longtime Bungie Halo player like myself and not hearing iconic Halo 2 and 3 sounds from series staples like the BR are initially off-putting. Enemy reaction to taking damage further enhance the sensation of stopping power your arsenal has, and the icing on top of the little X popping over your reticle with an even more aggressive hit marker when finishing off an enemy was enough to keep me playing alone. These are subtle details individually, but when taken together they elevate the moment-to-moment experience of playing Halo Infinite and complement Infinite's other endlessly entertaining piece of kit, the grapple shot. I'll be honest, I was pretty scared when they revealed that Halo Infinite would be an open world game. They aren't exactly my cup of tea, generally speaking, and that tends to be because so much of these games come down to moving from interesting point A to interesting point B, whereas in linear games, these points are called levels and are connected by loading screens, not miles of virtual terrain that need to be traversed. Games that transcend this for me are ones that can make the traversal from point to point fun, and the grapple shot in Halo Infinite facilitates that pretty well. The most surprising thing about the grapple shot is just how unencumbered it is. There aren't like limited areas you can use it or only certain types of terrain it can attach to. Whatever you point it at, as long as it's in range, it'll work, and this opens up a host of opportunities to enhance Infinite's gameplay loop beyond what was possible in previous titles. Verticality becomes a much more present option, and if you get the hang of it, you can quickly ramp up and maintain momentum to get the drop on enemies, or quickly reposition if you get overwhelmed. Its ability to grapple onto enemies and pull you in for a melee attack, as well as pulling the litany of plasma coils scattered everywhere in Infinite's map, or quickly pull an unattended gun to you to swap out a depleted weapon in your arsenal, means that the grapple shot augments nearly every facet of the gameplay loop, which, while fun, can also be a bit of a detriment. The grapple shot is probably my favorite part about this game, but the critic in me can't help but realize that the thing is definitely a fair bit overpowered as well. Infinite was clearly designed with the grapple shot in mind. It was the first thing they showed off in the reveal trailer. There is never a scenario in the game where it isn't useful to have, which in and of itself isn't a problem. It becomes an issue, though, when the grapple is only one of 4 equipable Spartan gear items you collect throughout the campaign, each with its own upgrade path as you collect Spartan cores scattered throughout Infinite's map. These other items are fun in concept, but in practice they're almost never worth swapping out the grapple shot for, especially if you start dumping points into the grapple itself, which only makes it even more OP compared to the others. One of the first upgrades quickly reduces the grapple's cooldown time significantly, making it trivial to use the grapple to quickly ascend any vertical obstacle on the map, or use its momentum to build up speed swinging from tree to building to mountainside, which makes it often faster and more flexible to grapple from place to place than rely on Infinite's vehicles, reducing their utility as well. Further upgrading the grapple adds a stun effect when grappling onto an enemy, and its final upgrade allows you to deliver a devastating charged tackle from range that can cut through elites and brutes like butter, as well as deliver an AoE stun on impact, making it safe to use even in crowded encounters since anyone surrounding your target gets incapacitated, letting you quickly dodge back to safety. These abilities are insanely fun to play with, and I use the hell out of them through the campaign, but they also meant that I never wanted to lose them by trying out any of the other kit Halo Infinite offers in the grapple's stead. To put it another way, there was only one time I switched out the grapple shot for something else, which was early in a boss fight that relied mostly on melee attacks. I figured the thruster ability would be better to avoid them, but the cooldown on that is way longer than the grapple shot, and it didn't move me nearly as far as just grappling out of the way would. So after a death, I switched back and beat him with that. I then proceeded to never switch it out again. I think a better idea may have been for the grapple shot to be a permanent part of Chief's kit, assigned to its own button, rather than making it part of the Spartan Core item set, meaning that it doesn't get upgrades to continue becoming more OP and leaves the Spartan gear slot permanently open for something else, letting you play around and properly integrate those other options the game gives you without losing what amounts to an essential part of Chief's abilities in this game. We can't really discuss Halo Infinite without taking a moment to reflect on the visuals. After all, that's the reason we're talking about Infinite now and aren't already a year into its content roadmap. I don't think I have to remind most how the reception to the reveal trailer for Infinite went over during E3 2020. Craig said pretty much everything that needed to be said there. If I'm being honest, the visuals, even at that point, didn't really bother me all that much. They didn't blow me away, but if you've been following this channel for any amount of time by now, you know I'm hardly a graphics snob. That being said, it's hard not to be impressed by the level of detail Infinite displays now upon release. It's not the best looking game I've ever seen, and I don't think it could have been considering Microsoft's decision to also have the game run on the original Xbox One, which is now 8 years old, but the extra year in the oven really let the artists at 343 refine what they already had and give everything in Infinite a degree of polish that lets its visuals punch above their poly count. Chief's armor is littered with grit and scratches that reflect his endless one-man campaign against the Covenant. Textures on objects are coated with extraneous detail as well. Everything pops. Although Zeta Halo may look sharp, but that's probably mostly because there's not much to it visually. There's only 2 environments in this entire map. The overworld, which is like if you made the second level of the original Halo into an entire open world map, and it facilitates the sandbox experience, which makes up the bulk of Infinite's campaign, and then there's the Forerunner structures, which are essentially dungeons that are more structured combat scenarios that feel more like traditional Halo's more claustrophobic second halves. Personally, I've never been all that bothered by repetitive environment assets. I'm too busy shooting things to really care much about what the environment I'm in looks like, but that's just me. I know a lot of other people can quickly get fatigued by the repetition, so your mileage here may vary. It's also worth mentioning the shift in art direction. 343's artists brought a different look to the Halo franchise, starting with Halo 4. Colors were a bit more muted, the direction had a lot more detail, while also feeling a bit more grounded and less bombastic than the saturated color palette and almost cartoonish design sentiment from Bungie's treatment of the series. This was probably due to a number of factors, from the early 2010s in general leaning more into the gritty, subdued realism look as a whole, to 343 being a literal different team of artists that most likely wanted to bring their own ideas to the franchise. In that regard, I'm almost a little disappointed by the retreat back to the familiar. I never disliked the work 343 did, and while it was a different looking Halo, this was also a different group of people bringing these characters and worlds to life, so I didn't really mind them introducing their own spin to everything. Obviously though, most of the gaming public disagreed with me, so 343 is now doing their best to emulate and iterate on the classic aesthetic Bungie pioneered. As a fan of Halo, it's comforting to see the streamlined designs and the bright colors again. As a fellow creator, I can't help but feel a little sad that the artists at 343 are now purposely working in a more restricted capacity. Zeta Halo looking pretty is one thing, but how does it function as a sandbox? Halo has flirted with non-linearity before. The aforementioned second level of the original game gave you a rather large section of the ring to explore as you rescued stranded Marines from 3 crash sites you could approach in any order. Beyond just the aesthetics, Halo Infinite functionally serves as that level on steroids as well. The map is littered with markers for similarly rescuing captured Marines, banished installations to infiltrate and overrun, and the aforementioned underground Forerunner facilities that serve as a more structured change of pace. All these missions I found pretty fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling I get when I'm playing almost every open world game, that this is more like a Halo spin on a game I've played dozens of times before at this point, rather than a game with its own identity. Clearing out encampments and tracking down upgrades on a big map is fun, but I just did the same thing a few months ago in Spider-Man Miles Morales, and before that in Ghost of Tsushima, and before that in God of War 2018. Each of these are different gameplay experiences, but they're all built around the same progression structure. and once you play enough of them, that pattern starts to become more and more apparent. And that's me, someone who makes a habit of not playing these games regularly. If you're a Ubisoft fan, I have no idea how blatant this loop will feel to you, for better or worse. Probably the most unfortunate part about Zeta Halo is how empty it is. I spent around 20 hours playing through the game on normal difficulty, and another around 2 hours wrapping up the bulk of the rest of the map, recapturing all the fobs, rescuing all the stranded Marines, assassinating all the banished high-priority targets, and finding all the hidden Spartan cores. The only things I didn't do was collect all the audio logs, which I couldn't be bothered with, and destroy all the propaganda towers, because that would mean no more comms officer Grunt, and he's the best character in this entire fucking game bar none.
So wait a minute. I just found out that the Master Chief's name is John. John? We're afraid of a guy named John? Are you kidding me?
There aren't many surprises on Zeta Halo. If it exists, there's a map marker for it. Most of Zeta is just an empty space that's nice to look at and an anchor point for the grapple shot. There's barely any post-game, at least not yet. The post-credits scene implies that there will be some kind of DLC, and some of the islands are suspiciously sparse of content at the moment. As nice as Infinite cleaned up visually after the backlash, I feel like that time would have been better spent giving Zeta Halo more things to do, as opposed to a facelift. As it stands, Halo Infinite feels like a better version of Metal Gear Solid 5, which is honestly more insulting to Infinite than it deserves, but that was the thought in the back of my mind my entire playthrough. It's probably my favorite playing game in the franchise, but the move to open world leaves you with a largely empty map that doesn't have a whole lot going on in it, and it feels like it's still a work in progress. Hopefully Microsoft, unlike Konami, will let 343 actually finish their game. Arguably the biggest sticking point people have with 343's tenure over the Halo franchise, outside of the visuals, has been how they've handled the narrative of their games. Halo 4 and 5 were both much different in tone than Bungie's entries in the series, bringing an introspective look at Master Chief, putting more focus on the man inside the armor and the effect his legend has on him, while simultaneously introducing a lot of crazy out there concepts with its antagonists that were much more wacky than the aliens want to shoot us that Bungie set up with the original series of games. Guardians in particular left the canon in a rather messy place by the end, so 343 had their work cut out for them with a game that clearly was trying to function as a sort of soft reboot, moving on from the numbered entries and retooling the visual style they've been trying to move the series into, and shifting back into something that feels more like Legacy Halo. I'm so incredibly torn on 343's writing. I could easily go on an entire tangent here about my thoughts on this part of the franchise, and indeed, I just had to delete a paragraph where I started doing just that. Let me know in the comments if you'd want a video talking about Halo lore, because I could definitely fill up the better part of a half an hour discussing it. But to keep things focused on Infinite, this newest Halo does pretty much the exact same thing 343's previous Halos have done, both good and bad. It very much wants to remind us that Master Chief is more than just a green suit of armor. John, the man, is who 343 wants us to think about as we play as Master Chief. And while I love that aspect of character study, like 4 and Guardians before it, they don't quite stick the landing, leading me more to appreciate what they're attempting rather than what they delivered. Also, similarly, Halo Infinite's story starts straightforward enough, but by the third act has ballooned into a narrative with way more moving parts than it really needed. Infinite starts off pretty simply, a battered UNSC on the brink of defeat after a 6-month-long fight on Zeta Halo against the Banished, a splinter faction of the Covenant originally introduced in Halo Wars 2. I didn't know that since I never played those games, and Infinite does little to clue in players less familiar with Halo's greater lore as to who the Banished are, similar to cold opening Halo 4 with Dr. Halsey, and introducing Blue Team in Halo 5 with no explanation on why serial loner Master Chief suddenly had a bunch of buddies. Chief wasn't present for the 6-month campaign against the Banished here, floating out in space after being thoroughly beaten by the Banished commander in the game's opening cutscene, before being recovered by chance by Echo 216, a Pelican pilot fleeing the losing war. The story starts deviating massively from what was set up as a rather straightforward underdog redemption story. I won't spoil anything here, but other players are introduced, and characters from earlier in the series make a sudden, if predictable, return in a way that never really clicked with me in light of everything that happened before. Considering where Guardians left off, this was probably necessary to delve into, but just like with Cortana at the end of Guardians and everything with the Didact in Halo 4, by the end of Infinite I was wondering why any of these extraneous things being introduced and developed were even needed when the initial, simple setup was compelling a reason to finish the fight on its own. Overall, Halo Infinite is a really fun experience. It's probably my favorite playing Halo game so far, and it might be the most replayable due to the non-linear nature and the opportunities the sandbox enables. There were already viral videos showing some crazy possibilities in the vein of Breath of the Wild, and 343 has stated they have no intention of patching out or shutting down any exploits players find. These kinds of moments are clearly part of the fun the team wants to facilitate, and hopefully Infinite will facilitate many more of them in the years to come. 343 still has some work to do in my opinion on the narrative side of Halo. They're obviously huge Halo nerds over there and know everything about the lore, but that is almost a detriment due to how often supplementary material bleeds into the story of their mainline entries, making it hard for casual fans or newcomers to know what's going on, and they've still yet to stick the landing in their third act. But Infinite is a fantastic 25-hour romp with tons of fun weapons and mechanics to play around with. I don't regret my time playing it, and I doubt you will either.